Welcome back, everybody, and thanks for joining us for another Terror and Urban Myths. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and give us a like. If you're enjoying all this unsettling stuff, we're going to be exploring a theme that keeps cropping up again and again in urban legends and all over online forums. Encounters with strange women often alone behaving erratically in public spaces. If you've ever walked home alone at night, you've probably felt that little shiver down your spine, wondering who or what could be lurking just out of sight.
Yeah.
These stories, often called woman on the bridge narratives, are surprisingly common.
Yeah.
And lately it seems like there are even more of these accounts popping up, and a lot of them are pretty chilling. We're lucky to have an expert with us tonight who can help us figure out what makes these stories so captivating, and maybe shed some light on why they resonate so deeply with us.
What's really interesting is that these women on the bridge stories are so consistent, not only across different regions, but also across different time periods. They tap into a primal fear of the unknown, that feeling of being watched or followed, which is unsettling no matter where or when you live.
It's that feeling of vulnerability, isn't it? Like the world is suddenly a much more unpredictable place than we like to believe.
Exactly. And when you think about the common elements in these stories, a lone woman encountered at night behaving erratically, her intentions are unclear. It's almost like a blueprint for a modern horror story, and it plays directly into our deepest fears.
We got an account recently that fits this description perfectly.
Oh.
It's about a man walking home at night who keeps running into the same woman. Every time he sees her, her actions get a little more unsettling. She hides in the shadows, stares intensely, even seems to be following him at a distance. And here's the detail that really stuck with me. She's carrying a child's backpack.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That detail adds a whole new layer of intrigue, doesn't it? It brings in something unexpected and makes you question her motives. Is there even a child involved? Or is the backpack a symbol of something else entirely? Maybe a distraction from her real intentions.
Right. It's that ambiguity that makes these stories so unnerving. We're left to fill in the blanks, and our imaginations often go wild, conjuring up the worst-case scenarios. The person telling this story doesn't even have to try that hard. The listener's mind does most of the work.
You're absolutely right. It's the same reason campfire stories are so effective. Our brains are wired to look for patterns and explanations, and when we're confronted with a situation that's both unsettling and ambiguous, we tend to play it safe, imagining the most threatening possibilities.
That makes perfect sense. And it's not just the ambiguity of the woman's behavior that makes it creepy. These encounters often happen in dimly lit, deserted areas, which makes you feel even more vulnerable. Isolation and darkness are classic horror tropes for a reason. They tap into our primal fear of being alone and exposed to danger.
Absolutely. Think about it. We're hardwired to be on alert for potential threats in our surroundings, and these stories exploit that instinct, taking something as ordinary as walking home at night and turning it into a potential nightmare.
It's like those stories prey on our very survival instincts. And speaking of exploiting vulnerabilities, one account we received really highlights the very real dangers that can lurk online. This one's about a woman who's contacted on social media by someone claiming to be her long-lost half-sister. At first, everything seems legit, matching photos, mutual friends, shared memories. But then things start to get creepy. The sister tries to lure her to a park at night, a park known for its high crime rate. It's almost like the sister is setting a trap.
That is disturbing.
It is.
The story is especially disturbing because it emphasizes how easily our trust can be manipulated, especially online. It's a harsh reminder that we need to be careful about who we connect with online and always verify information before meeting someone in person, especially in a vulnerable setting like an empty park after dark.
And the fact that the perpetrator is pretending to be a family member makes it even more sinister. It preys on our desire for connection, our longing to belong. The victim lets her guard down, thinking she's found a missing piece of her family history, only to realize she's walked right into a potential nightmare.
Right. It twists something positive and hopeful, the idea of reuniting with family, into something dark and dangerous. And sadly, stories like this are becoming more and more common as our lives become increasingly intertwined with the online world. It raises all sorts of questions about how we protect ourselves, not just physically, but emotionally as well. How do we guard against being manipulated by someone who knows exactly which buttons to push?
It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the specific anxieties that a lot of women face in urban environments, where the threat of violence or harassment can feel constant. These women on the bridge stories, even though they're often exaggerated or embellished, reflect genuine concerns about safety and the need to always be on guard.
You're absolutely right. It's not about living in fear, but about being empowered to take precautions and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. We have to remember that. And it's not just about physical safety we're talking about. These encounters can have a lasting psychological impact. They can lead to anxiety always being on edge and loss of trust in other people.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, even if nothing physically bad happens, the fear and uncertainty from the encounter can stick around for a long time.
Exactly. One account we got illustrates this perfectly. A woman was stalked by this guy she barely knew. He'd show up at her house at places she'd mentioned online, even followed her to stores she went to. It's a scary example of how someone can invade your personal space and make you feel like you're constantly being watched and vulnerable.
It must be terrifying to always feel like you're looking over your shoulder, never knowing when this person might pop up.
Yeah.
And in this account, the woman didn't feel like she could tell her parents because she knew they'd be super upset.
Yeah.
That adds another layer to this situation, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It shows the isolation that a lot of stalking victims go through. They feel trapped, burdened by fear and secrecy, afraid to burden their loved ones or that people won't believe them. It's a vicious cycle that can be really hard to escape.
It's heartbreaking to think about the emotional toll that kind of experience takes. It also reminds us that these situations aren't just about isolated incidents, but about patterns of behavior that can have lasting and devastating consequences.
That's right. We need to shift the focus from blaming the victim and start holding the perpetrators accountable and create a culture where survivors feel like they can speak up and get help.
That's so important. We need to make it clear that these behaviors are unacceptable and that victims deserve support and understanding, not judgment or silence.
I completely agree. We need to encourage open and honest conversations about these issues and challenge the societal norms that let these patterns of behavior continue.
I'm also thinking about how these stories often blur the lines between what's real and what's made up, especially when they tap into our existing fears and anxieties. For example, we got an account about a woman who ran into a clown in a park. Not just any clown, but one dressed really similar to a fictional character known for being brutal.
Oh, wow. That's a great example of how these stories play on our shared cultural anxieties. They take something we associate with fun and childhood, a clown, and turn it into something scary and threatening. The woman in the account said she felt this immediate sense of dread, like something was terribly wrong, even though logically she knew it was probably just a coincidence.
Yeah, it's like our brains are programmed to look for danger in certain situations, especially when they match up with stories we've already heard, whether it's from books, movies, or other people.
Exactly. Our minds are always trying to find patterns and make connections, even when those connections might not be accurate or rational. In this case, knowing about that fictional killer clown definitely influenced how the woman saw that real-life encounter, even though it turned out to be harmless.
It makes you wonder, how do we balance our natural instinct to protect ourselves with the need to avoid being paranoid or letting irrational fears take over?
That's a tough question, and there's no simple answer. It's about finding a balance between acknowledging the real dangers in the world and not letting them control our every thought and action. We need to be informed, aware, and prepared, but also have a healthy amount of skepticism and critical thinking. Not every creepy encounter means something bad is going to happen.
You're right. It's about finding that middle ground, being cautious, but not letting fear take over. We need to trust our gut, but also realize that our perceptions can sometimes be influenced by things around us, like the stories we hear or the anxieties we already have.
Exactly. It's about being aware of our own biases and acknowledging that things aren't always what they seem. Sometimes a clown is just a clown, even if it triggers a fear response.
And sometimes, unfortunately, those fears are justified. One account that really stuck with me was about a woman who went camping with a guy she met online. It shows how dangerous online dating can be and how easy it is for people to lie about who they are and hide their true intentions.
That's true.
Yeah, this story is a serious reminder to be careful about who you connect with online. It's easy to get carried away with the excitement of meeting someone new, but it's so important to make sure they are who they say they are and what their intentions are before meeting them in person, especially in a secluded setting like a camping trip.
Absolute.
In this case, the woman ignored a bunch of red flags, like the guy's inconsistent stories, his need to control her, and his anger when she tried to set boundaries. It's a typical example of how abusers groom their victims, slowly breaking down their defenses and isolating them from their support systems.
Right. And tragically, the abuse got worse and ended in sexual assault. This story is a sad reminder of how common sexual violence is and the devastating effect it has on survivors.
It's also a reminder of how complicated it can be to report those kinds of crimes. The woman in the account thought about calling the police, but ultimately decided not to, because she was afraid of what might happen and the pain of reliving the trauma. It's a heartbreaking reality for a lot of survivors.
Absolutely. Many survivors feel like they can't speak up because of shame, fear, or lack of trust in the justice system. It's so important that we create a culture where survivors feel supported and empowered to come forward, knowing they'll be believed and their experiences will be taken seriously. We have a long way to go in that area.
You're right. We need to keep challenging the societal norms that often silence survivors and create an environment where they feel safe and supported to seek justice and healing. These stories, even though they're tough to hear, are important reminders of the work that still needs to be done.
I totally agree. And I think it's important to note that even though these stories focus on encounters with women, they speak to broader societal problems that affect everyone. Gender inequality, violence, and the erosion of trust in our communities are things we all need to address.
You're right. These stories are like symptoms of a bigger problem in society. They reflect the anxieties and fears we all face both individually and as a community. Before we move on to our last part, I want to pause and ask you, our listener, a question. What stood out to you the most from these accounts? What connects with your own experiences or anxieties?
We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your reflections with us on social media or leave a comment.
And remember, we'll be back next time with the final part of this exploration of Woman on the Bridge encounters. Welcome back to Terror and Urban Myths. We're wrapping up our look at Woman on the Bridge stories, those unsettling encounters that mix reality and folklore and tap into some of our deepest fears. We've covered a lot of ground, from those stories of bizarre behavior and online manipulation to the scary reality of stalking and the complexities of reporting abuse. Before we finish up, I wanted to touch on something that's been bugging me this whole time: the role of gender in these narratives.
Yeah, that's a good point and a really important part of these stories. The woman on the bridge figure is almost always female, and that reflects societal anxieties and stereotypes about women, especially when they're out in public.
Right. It seems like women are overrepresented both as victims and as these figures of mystery or fear. Why is that?
It's complicated and it goes back centuries. It's about how culture has shaped our views. On one hand, women are often seen as vulnerable and needing protection. But on the other hand, they're depicted as mysterious, unpredictable, even dangerous. This creates a really interesting tension in these stories.
It's a double standard for sure. Women are expected to be both cautious and attractive, innocent and experienced. It's a lot to deal with, and it shows in how these stories are told and the anxieties they bring up.
Exactly. And it highlights how important it is to challenge these harmful stereotypes and create a culture where women feel safe and empowered to just live their lives without fear of judgment or harassment.
Yeah, these stories, while unsettling, can actually spark some important conversations about how we see and treat women in our society. It's not enough to just be aware of these problems. We need to actively work to dismantle the systems and beliefs that keep these harmful stereotypes alive.
I couldn't agree more. We need to create a world where everyone feels safe and respected, no matter their gender.
One thing's for sure from this discussion: these Woman on the Bridge encounters aren't just random events. They're tied to bigger societal issues, things like gender inequality, violence against women, and the loss of trust in our communities. These stories are like a mirror reflecting some of the darker parts of society back at us.
Exactly. They're symptoms of a bigger problem. They force us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our world and push us to do better.
So where do we go from here? What can we actually do to address these underlying issues and build a safer and fairer society?
It's a huge task, but starts with awareness and being willing to have open and honest conversations about these things. We need to challenge harmful stereotypes, create a culture of empathy and support, and hold people accountable for their actions.
It's about creating a culture where everyone feels safe, respected, and empowered. And it's something we have to do together. We all have a part to play in making that kind of world. Well, we've covered a lot in this episode of Terror and Urban Myths. We dug into the chilling world of Woman on the Bridge encounters, looking at the psychology, the folklore, and the societal anxieties that make these stories so powerful. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with one last thought. Do these stories tell us more about the women involved or about our own fears and anxieties? It's something to think about. And if you've enjoyed this exploration of terror and urban myths, don't forget to subscribe to the show and give us a like. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep those lights on.